that done. So, good morning, everybody. Fergus Dolan here from NALA. Delighted to have you here this morning for our webinar. Delighted to have Fionnaigh Connaughton from the Dublin Adult Learning Centre. Fiona will be presenting on strategies and approaches for teaching reading. And Fiona's keen, if you just joined in the last minute, you might have heard me say, Fiona's keen for people to write in their comments and questions as she goes along. So if she says something and a comment or question goes into your head, please write it down. You can write the comments or questions in the question stroke chat box. So question stroke chat, go over to the right of that and there's a box with an arrow pointing up. Click on that little box and it brings your question stroke chat into the center of your screen and write in your comments or your chat. And Fiona also has her colleague, Lisa Kilbride, who's on the line listening in. And Lisa's going to come in from time to time to offer further comments and thoughts and suggestions. And she'll also come in on the Q&A session at the end to give her opinions and ideas. So over to you, Fiona, all the best.
Okay, well, it's great to have everyone on board this morning. And as Fergus said, my name is Fionnaigh Connaughton and I work in DALC. We're the Dublin Adult Learning Centre. We're based in Montchoy Square. And really we work with basic one-to-ones, basic groups, all the way up to accredited courses like FETAC or QQI level 5 in healthcare and special needs assistant. Now we work in a very kind of creative way, very learner-centred. And just to say, when Fergus first approached me about doing a workshop on or a webinar on reading, I thought, gosh, it's a very broad topic. So like if I was doing this training in the real world, I would sit down with people and see what setting you're working in, what level. So just to say, the tone of today's webinar is really to look at the components of reading, to look at some approaches and strategies and resources that have worked for us. But really, I'd like people to think about and reflect on what setting you're working on, what applies to you during the webinar. So lots of thinking during and reflecting afterwards. And Lisa's on board then as well to give her insight, because Lisa's my colleague in DALC. All right, so you can see my autumn leaves there. I put that up, and I think just with lockdown and everything, it's very hard to believe that we are actually in autumn. And it's likely that people who are attending today's webinar, you haven't actually worked with your group or your student yet. So this is just a little resource I would use in groups. Now I've compiled with a colleague of mine, Aisling, a list of energizers, icebreakers, you know, that you can use in a group. So I have a blog post in that if people are interested. But just to kind of get us warmed up, it's Thursday, you may have attended the other NALA webinars. So I thought we'd start with a couple of energizers that are done remotely. And hopefully with lockdown, we may not have to go completely to remote learning. So we might just start with it. And I'd like everyone, wherever you are in Kerry, Donegal, I'd like you to, first of all, point to your front door. So wherever you are, point to your front door. Okay, point to the ceiling. And point to something red that you may see in front of you. Okay, and so on. So these, I think, sort of the fun element and the creative element, even work with adults, can be really useful. So if anyone is interested in some of those icebreakers, you can put it in the question box and let me know. All right, so let's get down then to the nitty-gritty of looking at reading. Now, again, because I don't know what setting people are working in, I think a very good way to start is to think about good questions to ask yourself when you're working on reading. And the first one there, what is the purpose of reading? Now, if I was to ask that, and you may think, you could say it's knowledge of some kind. So say, to do with health, you could be reading a Calpol bottle, you could be reading about an appointment from the doctor or the hospital. It could be news, reading the newspaper, or for the purposes of work and study, or indeed entertainment, you know, reading about your favorite football team in the newspaper and so on, and reading novels. But also with adults and the people we're working with, it's really around what social practices or roles people have in life. So if you're a parent, you need to be able to read emails from the school, particularly if people were doing homeschooling. If your children are involved, say, in GAA, you need to be able to read maybe a WhatsApp message and so on. So, and also we remember before the coronavirus, the election, gosh, it's hard to believe. So even for citizenship, for the purpose of voting. So really, the reason I'm mentioning purpose is because I think that dictates the motivation why a student, a potential student, is coming back to learning. So, to think about that. All right, the next question then is, what is your student group or level? Now, when we talk about levels in adult learning, it can be quite a mutable term, because often a basic reader may not be a basic thinker. But I think in terms of level, someone who's new to reading, they may have a very negative experience of reading. They may have a learning difficulty such as dyslexia and so on, or maybe English isn't their first language. And it seems obvious, but this really dictates the type of materials you use and the pace at which you teach. Okay, now, what is your student group or interest? Now, particularly if you're working in a group that isn't accredited or in a one-to-one, you have the luxury of getting students and adults involved in reading things that they're interested in. And really, I think it's fair to say that people are more likely to start reading and progress in reading if it's something they're interested in. And it's a way, and the same goes for kids, actually. You know, the way we have this, we want people should be reading, kids should be reading Harry Potter or whatever, but really it's about what people are interested in reading. And it's a good way of generating text, which I'll look at later. And even if you're in a group, or if you're, say, tutoring a group that is accredited, and I'm thinking of QQI and communications at level 3 and 4, there's lots of components that are quite open. So people have to read, say, a factual text, but you could pick a text that they're interested in, you know. Okay, and finally, the question is, what overall reading skills are you trying to teach? So really, as educators, as tutors, it's good to be mindful of the fundamental skills as a literacy teacher that you're trying to address. So even though someone may come in for a particular purpose, to help children with their homework to become more confident in the world with reading, I think it's good to think of what skills you want to sort of teach people long term that they may not need in the immediate. Okay, so they're just good questions to reflect on. Okay, this is down to the I suppose the nitty-gritty, the science bit, as they would say in the shampoo commercials. This, I'm going to look at the elements involved in reading. Okay, so I suppose most people who are attending are competent readers, and we take it for granted, but I think it's good to look at what are the elements of reading. And I have 2 points here. You could say there's 2 sides to reading. It's the ability to quickly and automatically recognize words, but that's nothing without comprehension. So the ability to understand what's being read. We often find, and even in my practice, people could be reading a piece and they get down to the end and they think, God, I haven't understood anything I've read. Or they may get something, say a letter in the door, I don't know, from the doctor at the school, and it's not important for them to read absolutely everything. It's the purpose is, you know, to comprehend when the appointment is and so on. All right, so just to look at those in more detail, I have now these are the first element, okay, and I think it's a very key element is in reading is decoding or phonological awareness. So this is your phonics, the ability to distinguish the sounds in letters and words. It's a key skill. Now I know people would think, oh, a lot of words are, you know, are not spelled the way they sound and so on, but you know, it does follow a system of sounds, reading. And I think definitely with basic students, they sometimes think reading is a very visual skill, that you just learn words individually and that's how you become a better reader. But after a while, people realize that when you read, every letter has a sound, and that people use it as a strategy for reading. Now, I know some people may be aware of phonics. You may use it in your practice, and like there's a ton of resources and worksheets around phonics. But just to point you to a very good website, it's called Phonics Ireland. Now it does it in quite a sort of systematic way. So it starts with the sounds of the consonants and moves on to the vowels and so on. But there's some good resources, and as far as I understand, it's completely free. But it's synthetic phonics, so you're just learning the sounds individually. But it's something you integrate into something when you're tutoring students, you know, that you're mindful of the sound. So I just want to show you a sheet here, and I can show this to people afterwards. And this is something, now, obviously you wouldn't give this to a student, but I think as tutors, it's very good to have this resource. So I've condensed the sounds of the letters into this sheet here. So in English, you may know there's 44 sounds, but there's only 26 letters. So the 21 consonants usually have one sound, the vowels have two sounds. So it can feel like a bit of a minefield, but I think it's good to be familiar with that yourself. So if people, for example, get stuck in a word beginning with B, you could say, well, that letter B has the B sound, or SH, you can see the consonant combinations there. The sound is sh, and so on. So, and actually and Lisa, you may come in on this, I think for a lot of our students, it's almost a eureka moment that they think, oh my God, I just need to learn the sounds of the letters, you know, or that they're, just when I see a word I don't know, I need to break it up and think about the sounds. I've also mentioned on that sheet prefixes. So, you know, and suffixes. So prefixes and suffixes would be the chunks in words, you know, so there you can see it with the prefix. So you see that attached to words like unhappy and so on. So people just read that as a whole chunk. And a suffix is a word ending. So ing, even a basic reader would say, oh yes, ing. That's the way it sounds, or meant, apartment, and so on. So I just think it's a good little resource to have. But again, you wouldn't do it at every session, but as words come up, it's just to be aware of, you know, can we sound out the word, and so on. Okay, and I can give this to people afterwards. Now, the next element in reading then is text awareness. All right, so that simply means, depending on the text people are reading, so say a menu, a leaflet that might come in the door, you know, those leaflets that come in from Lidl or Aldi, little booklets about their deals, a hospital letter, even a poem, a newspaper article, that you become aware of what type of text you're reading, you know, even using things like pictures to predict. So if you see a newspaper article with Leo Varadkar, you know, or a picture of pubs or something, you might think, gosh, it's about the pubs opening and so on. But also, as students become more confident in reading, they become more aware of meaning. And I've mentioned their syntax, grammar, meaning. So if you're reading, say, something, you know, I went to the shop and I bought a elephant. Okay, that doesn't make sense, you know. So people sort of realize that it's something you're getting used to as you're reading. All right, so the next element in reading is probably one of the most important ones, is comprehension. And I'll look actually later on at strategies and how you can monitor comprehension. But really, it's that when people are reading, it has to make sense. You know, that you know, people when you're reading something, that you know, that it's something that has to make sense. All right, and that. Okay, so the next point then is, now people may have come across this before, is the top-down versus bottom-up reading. Now I'll go back to this, but really that is a strategy we probably use all the time. So the top-down would be the big picture when you're reading, all right? So it's what meaning you're bringing to the text. So I thought of a good example. You know, you see all the yellow and black signs all over the place. You know, okay, it must be information about the coronavirus. And then the bottom up would be looking at the detail in it. So you may see a picture of a mask, but then the word like social distancing. So the top down really is the big picture and using your prediction skills. And the bottom up then is the decoding the unfamiliar words. All right, and finally, people may have come across this before, the elements in reading, or the skills that we're mindful of, are skimming, scanning, fact versus opinion. And I've put there, it's often required in line with accreditation. So these are anyone who's teaching QQI level 1, 2, or 3, or 4 or 5. There's certain skills that you're trying to teach. So skimming and scanning, say, if someone was booking a flight online, they need to go down and find, you know, the time, or a timetable if you're reading a bus timetable. A good example, recently I had to work with one of my students who was renewing his stamp 4 status refugee status with the Department of Justice. So we needed to go through the Department of Justice website, which like is an absolute minefield. But you know, we weren't going to read absolutely everything in the page, but we're scanning down for the information we needed. There's also higher level skills. Well, they're called higher level skills because they appear in QQI level 4 and 5 in the higher level accreditation courses. So they would be around critical thinking, critical analysis, the ability to detect bias in a text, you know. So if you're reading a newspaper article, who is it written by, things like that. So, you know, if you agree or disagree with it, sometimes people think if something is in the paper, it has to be true, things like that, you know. So now, all of these skills, I'm just telling you for your information. It's not something you do at every session, but it's just to be aware of. These are the skills to be aware of in the back of your mind when you are teaching. All right, I'm going to look then at strategies with working with the basic reader. Now, maybe many people like me, you've attended lots of webinars. During lockdown, I was on lots of webinars, and a lot of them, you know, they were fantastic, loads of resources, but I thought to myself, they weren't really geared to working with the basic students. So that's why I thought it's very important to cover that today. And particularly in DALC, we would work with basic groups. All right, and the first resource to make people aware of, you may have heard this as well, is the language experience approach. Now, anyone who's done any tutor training or anyone who's aware of teaching literacy, this is almost like a bread and butter skill as a literacy teacher that you would use. So really, the language experience is the method of teaching literacy based on an adult's experience of language. So really, in a nutshell, it's if you're sitting down with a student, they tell their story, you listen, you transcribe, and then it generates a text. Okay, so it's really reading what you say written down. So I'm going to show an example. Now, this is an example of a student I worked with before. So basically, he told me a couple of sentences about himself, so I wrote them down. Now, you can see it there. My name is Tom. I live in Dublin. I have 4 children and so on. Now, just to be clear with the language experience, you write down the way the person expresses it. So I could have written down my favourite team is Manchester United, but I just wrote down I'm a Man U fan. So we use this then to generate a text. Now, that particular student was and I'm not using his real name, was particularly basic. So this piece, it looks simple, but we were working on this for months because it was, you know, he was a very basic student. So, oh yes, with the language experience now, my first experience with it, I understood the language experience as a way of people writing down about themselves, but I actually use it maybe in a more creative way. So even if people in a group would tell me a story about a holiday, or remember a couple of years ago, one student came in on a Monday morning and he was in London when there was a terrorist attack. So I thought, gosh, so he told it to me and I wrote down a couple of sentences and I typed it up and we used that as a reading piece. So, you know, so I think you can make a leap from it really. Now, on the slides here, so what follow-on work would you do with the language experience? Now, I think it's worth going through these. So you can see it there. You would read the piece to the student and then read it together. Now, sometimes students think, oh, I'm only working on reading if I'm reading it. But sometimes listening, as a tutor, I would sit down, read it, put my finger underneath. So people are getting used to how sentences sound and visually and so on. I've done this before. You might take out a sentence, my name is Tom, cut it up just on paper or cardboard and almost like tiles, get them to rearrange it and so on. You could make flashcards with each individual word to give people, just so they're getting used to the visual. And also you can start to work on that kind of text awareness where you work on words ending in ing. And in the story said, I like watching. So you could show how action words, verbs, when you add an ing. So you could maybe brainstorm on other ing words, you know, things that you do, sitting, drinking, talking, and so on. So you're building up a vocabulary. Now, I put in close there. Now, sometimes close can be confusing, but I would see close here as a reading skill that you're using, not a writing, because you're not getting them to, close is really when you blank out a word in a sentence. You're not getting them to try and remember it from memory or spelling. You're getting them to track. So you would have, say, the page there, you know, intact. And you would say, type that out again and blank out maybe some of the smaller words like is and in and so on, and get them to track and write it in. So they're getting used to, that's the word love, or that's the word Dublin, and so on. Because often you find students, they start to memorize what they're reading. So I think it's worth doing things like that. All right, so I hope everyone's with me. Now, just to say with the basic reader, oh yes, some of the other elements I wanted to mention there are the Dolch list. Now, people may be familiar with the Dolch list. Anyway, children in school, usually they start off with the Dolch list. So really, the Dolch list is really the everyday words, high frequency words, and they say it makes up half of all reading, all right? And I think it gives a lot of students confidence that, you know, even if they're reading a text with a lot of words they don't know, they will know the Dolch words. Now, myself and Lisa were talking about this. She's used the Dolch list in a very creative way, but I just want to show you. Now, you could do any Google search for a Dolch list, but here I have a sheet. I hope everyone can see it. It is, I've called it, sorry, the 100 sight words. Now, that's a back-to-back page. It looks like there's a lot of words there. But for one group, I work with the spelling group on a Friday morning. I printed this off as a kind of a resource, and they have it in a Polly Pocket. Now, I wouldn't do it all the time, but every now and then I might take it out, get people in pairs to hover their finger over it and plonk it down and see do they know the word. So it's really that they're getting used to these words, because unfortunately these aren't words that you can learn by breaking them up or anything like that. They're completely visual words that you just learn as a whole, and they can be deceptive, like the TH words, the WH. They can be tricky enough, even though they're very common words, particularly words like what and which and when can be really, really difficult for students, because you know they're not nouns. So, you know, it's probably easier for some people to read a word like, you know, table or something, because you have a visual. But for these, you don't have an actual visual picture. In the past, I've done creative things, like I might take the word out, we might colour it in, things like that. I might draw on Lisa, actually, because I thought it was you work with a very basic group of learners, and you've used the Dolch words in a very creative way. So I think it might be good, Lisa, for you to pop in.
Yeah, no, just one of the things we found online was a type of, like a snakes and ladders type game with the Dolch words on it, where you throw a dice and you move and you work in pairs and you ask each other a list of words when you land on a particular square. So it's just another way, because unfortunately those words, you have to repeat them, and trying to find ways of repeating them that's not really boring, you know.
Yes.
But people do have difficulty with the WH and the TH ones, but find that they're increasingly fast at some of the others. So it's, you know, it builds confidence.
And have you found, Lisa, that doing it in a sort of creative, fun way, that people do get used to it? Because it can be quite hard if people have a block about a word, you know, if the word, say, when or what comes up.
Yeah, and it's hard to work into a class because it's kind of dull. But if you had the game on the table when people came in, they were inclined to start playing before the class started, just with each other, and you know, it just provided a way of practicing those words.
Fantastic. That's great. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks. Okay, so the other thing I'd like to draw people's attention to is book creator. Now, this is something that we all did a webinar ourselves, and we were involved in training during lockdown on book creator. People may be familiar with it, but it's basically it's a simple tool for creating digital books, and it's free. And I think it particularly, well, hopefully we're not facing another lockdown, but it's something that we're trying to use in DALC, because we realize that people, you know, are engaged even with say WhatsApp. And I just want to show you an example. I think it's good to speak from examples. So basically, a colleague of mine, Sinead, she created this book on Book Creator. Now, I hope everyone can see it. It's called Locked Out. So she wrote it about, lockdown. And first of all, the interface is quite simple, it's not very busy for a basic student, which I think is nice. So it's great. I mean, you can add pictures, you can work with the students, say, to create their own book and so on. But also, I think this is fantastic. There's kind of a default where it reads it to you, but she recorded her own voice. So I'm just going to show you a clip here.
Locked out. It was April 2020. COVID-19 was very serious. Ireland and the whole world was in lockdown. Everyone had to stay inside.
Okay, and so on. So, and it's very easy for students to, like Sinead told me that she sent this particular book to her one-to-one student on WhatsApp, and the student just clicked the link. They don't need to download Book Creator or anything like that. Also, there's different functions. So say if a student doesn't want it read to them, but you could put the little speaker icon beside a tricky word. So say if the word was guidelines there, the person, if they were stuck on that, could click on it. Now, there is quite a lot of words there, but you could make the font bigger and you could be really creative with it. So, and I know in DALC we've created small little readers based on, say, a hobby. One particular man is really interested in pigeons, so we wrote a book about pigeons, and maybe about shopping in Dublin and so on. So it's kind of another way of doing that, and people feel a sense of satisfaction that they're learning some technology skills as well, which I think is great. So if there's anything I'm talking about, as I said, just to remind me at the end. Now, okay, now let's see how this works. I thought, okay, I've mentioned the language experience where the student speaks and you write down a kind of a creative way of doing it. And especially if you're doing it remotely, is to use Google Docs microphone. Now, I hope people are familiar with Google Docs, but I'll show you an example here. So Google Docs kind of actually works very like Microsoft Word. It looks very like it, it's slightly different. So I'll open up a blank Google Doc here. All right, so it's like a blank page. Let me open it here. So this is something I haven't actually tried yet with students, but I think it could work really well. So as you can see, it looks very like Microsoft Word. So what you do is you open a blank page, you go up to Tools. I hope everyone can see that. Tools. Okay. A little bit slow, and you go down to Voice Typing. All right. And you click on it here. So I'm going to try this. Today is Thursday. I met Fergus today. We were talking about reading. My friend is going for a COVID test. Yes, okay, it's worked, because a couple of times when I did that, oops, I can stop. A couple of times when I did that, it didn't pick up, absolutely everything. And as you can see now, it will need a certain amount of editing if you were using this to generate a piece. So you need to put in punctuation like full stops. I'm surprised it picked up Fergus, because I did this with some Irish names as well and picked it up. So I imagine it's sensitive to words that we use all the time. COVID came up there, which is great. So I imagine if you put it in, say, a place name, I don't know, like Loughrea or Tralee or something, you'd have to check, does it know those proper nouns? But I just think it's a good little resource. So so I hope people go off and explore that. All right, so okay, just to bring it back then now, I think any training I've done, I sort of use this as a way of summarizing all levels, all groups, and all text you're using or in any setting. If you think of approaching reading as before, so pre-reading strategies, during reading, while the student or while you're reading a piece in class, and then after reading. So I'm going to go through those separately. All right, now usually when I'm doing training, as I said, I would know if people are working with a higher level group or more basic, and I might pull out an actual text as a context for looking at these strategies. But I think I'll just mention some of the texts that I've most recently used. So even if, say, you're reading a form, a medical card form, even if you're reading something factual, like one of my students was doing a course on horticulture and gardening, so he was reading quite factual stuff. Or if you're doing some of the level 5 courses, say in nutrition, or one of our groups, they're doing level 5 in healthcare, so they have to read pieces on health. One of them was on dementia and so on. Or often we do seasonal reading pieces, like, you know, the origins of Halloween and so on. Or even, Fergus, you might mention this, the NALA resources. There's a ton of resources, say through the Read Right Nows, where they have NALA learner stories, so people's experience of coming back to learning. So any of those texts, basically, you can use pre-reading strategies, and that simply means you access prior knowledge through discussion. So before plonking it down in front of somebody, you do a brainstorm. What do you think the text might be about? You write up some keywords. You know, if people are using a smartboard, or I don't know what resources people have, but even in a one-to-one, I would write it down on a piece of paper, just to be aware that these are the words that you might expect. Prediction, what do you think the story might be about? So even by looking at it, particularly if it's a newspaper article, you know, what do you think it might be about? What angle is it about? Okay, and also things like photographs showing video clips. I think they can be fantastic to use, particularly if it's, I know on Friday morning, Lisa, you teach the history. If you're reading something like history, it's good to show a little video clip, say on 1916 or Michael Collins or whatever. And actually, I often think of examples as very much sort of from an Irish point of view, but even one of my students was from Romania, and we were reading a piece about Romania, tourism in Romania and so on. So we looked at, you know, a video clip on YouTube about if you were in Romania on holidays, what things might you visit, or even photographs of particular buildings and things, you know. So it's a kind of a way of leading in. All right, and identify text structure. So this is really sitting back and thinking, okay, how many paragraphs are in this? Even say if it was a letter, you might say, okay, the top of the letter, it's you know, from the HSE, all of that, talking about the text, talking around it before you read it. And then I've put down here the 3 times rule. So I think about this all the time in my groups, or even for myself. Often people would say, oh gosh, I read something and I came down to the bottom and I have no idea what I read. So I always say to people, you need to read something at least 3 times before you can even talk about it or comprehend it. So in a group situation, I would read it just for gist. I would read a piece to my students. I would invite people if they want to read a sentence each. Sometimes reading a sentence each can be good because people are aware then of punctuation, you know. You might say, well, you come to a full stop or whatever, and then you can read it again. So I think that thing of practice with reading at least 3 times is a very good thing. All right, so during reading strategies. Now, this is something to be aware of when your student is reading. So to underline or pick out a few unknown words. So we're hoping that students get familiar with, say, with the Dulce words, that they know the in-betweeny words, as I call them, the small words. But if you come across a tricky word, you could take it out, you could highlight it, you could talk about the new word, what do you think it means, break it up. Sometimes I think using the kind of spoken language in the classroom, taking out a word, you know, even I'm just thinking, say the word distance, social distancing, distance, you might look at the root word as distance, distancing, to keep your distance from someone, and so on, you know. So you talk about the word in different contexts, I think is good. All right, now during reading, encourage students to notice capital letters, full stops and other punctuation. Now again, depending on level, really, I suppose a basic student, I suppose, needs to understand that all sentences you stop at a full stop. But other punctuation marks, like you know, exclamation marks, often people use them in text actually, but things like quotation marks, depending on your level, say if you're reading a newspaper article and you know, you might say if it was about Liverpool or something, you know, the Liverpool manager said, and then the quotation mark. So you're showing that this as a punctuation mark when someone is speaking in a text. So again, they're not things you do all the time, but they're, you know, things people might ask you about, and to know the why, I think, is good. Now use bottom-up skills for unfamiliar words. So this is really your decoding bottom-up skills. So you take the word out, you break it up. Is there any chunk of the word you might be familiar with? Does it end in ing and so on? I always say to people, the first syllables, so say if it was a word like, you know, confirmation or something, con is the first syllable. You could look it up in the dictionary or use dictionary.com and so on. And sometimes with prediction, you know, so say if you're reading a piece about, you know, during lockdown, lots of things like weddings and were cancelled. What do you think the con be? It could be confirmation and so on. All right, and then now stopping after each paragraph or a few lines to monitor comprehension. So this is something even it's you know, a strategy and approach, even say reading with children. You know, you stop and you say, okay, you know, who's your favorite character in the story, or even what do you think might happen next, or you know, did it surprise you? Those kind of things. It's really stopping and recapping and so on. All right, and it's a way of kind of be more interactive with the text, if you know what I mean. All right, now I've called this post-reading strategies. Now this is probably something people do anyway. This is when you, I suppose, have questions after a piece, and sometimes if you're generating your own piece, you may come up with your own questions, but any piece that you do and any resource usually has questions. Now we think of, you know, when we're in a class that we need to do reading, writing and spelling at every session, but sometimes doing questions orally can be good if all you're working on is comprehension. Okay, so I've given some suggestions there, like revising expectations. Was the story what you expected? Did anything surprise you? Now I think this is a good one. Retelling what you think the author is saying. I think that's good, because often people, they might read a piece and they might want it to say a certain thing, but actually that's not what's in the piece. They might be given their opinion on it rather than a summary of it, you know. Okay, now writing, what do you think might happen next? So this is kind of a creative way you could have great fun, particularly if you're reading fiction or something. You know, if you're reading a juicy story, you might say, okay, what do you think will happen to the character and so on, you know, so you can be creative, or you could even do it in a group situation. Okay, and then comprehension questions. Now, people may be aware there's lots of different types of questions. Closed questions like true or false, multiple choice. Now with the basic students, I would use true and false. But again, don't assume that people know the difference between true and false. So I was surprised, actually, one student I worked with, they found even that difficult. We think of answering questions as very easy, but that's kind of something we're all familiar with, because we were competent in reading and we've all probably had a certain amount of schooling. But I know with the student, he didn't know the difference. So I said, you know, have I pink hair? Is that true or false? You know, see, it's false. Okay, so, you know, just to go through those concepts is what I mean. So, but I think true or false is good to do with the basic students. Multiple choice, kind of the A, B or C. Open-ended, that can be done orally or written. And then other questions like opinion type questions. So say if someone is reading a newspaper article on, you know, our Dublin the best GA team. Sorry, I shouldn't say that as a Galway person, but you know, that they write, you know, their opinion on it and so on. And actually, recently I did a piece for a level 5 group on tattoos, which I thought was interesting. So some of the questions were about the piece, so there were kind of see did people comprehend the piece, but then we had great fun saying the pros and cons, you know, for tattoos. Do people agree with tattoos or not? You know, so there's lots of different types of questions you can use depending on your setting. And then finally, to go over unfamiliar words. Now, dictionaries, they've probably become a bit more redundant. Sometimes I think it's a good skill because, you know, you're getting people to find the word, and it helps with repetition that they need to go through it. But I think dictionary.com is a fantastic app. You can download on your phone, or you can do it as a website. And sometimes it's good if people don't know how to pronounce a word. You can use dictionary.com. I would use that a lot in my evening group, higher level. So if it's a tricky word, we might look at dictionary.com, and there's a microphone, you know, that says the word for you. So, all right. So I hope everyone found those useful, those strategies. And again, they're not something that you would do all the time at every session, but it's just to be aware of those three, you know, the pre-reading, the during and the post when you're working with any text. Okay, now I've shown PowerPoint slides with lots of words, so here I thought I'd give you a visual. Now, I think it's very good to be thinking about, in general, thinking about our practice when it comes to reading and our role. And I put up a picture here of scaffolding now. I'm coming to you here from Dunleary in Dublin, and you can see there's lots more building, and actually they're building apartments across the way, so I can literally see scaffolding as well as thinking about it metaphorically. But really, scaffolding, if you think of scaffolding, I would do this in any training. If you think of what the function of scaffolding is, all right, you could say it's there as a support. Okay, it's not permanent. It's something that, you know, moves along so as the building gets higher and so on. So if you think of your role when you're teaching reading is that you are almost acting like scaffolding. You're there to support where people need help, but also as people get better with reading, that you're given some level of independence and so on. Now, I'm not going to get too bogged down on the theory, but people may have come across this concept in teaching and learning, really, or working with people and all, is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And the way I look at this is, okay, is what I'm asking my students to do to read actually too hard, or is what I'm asking them to read too easy? And if it's both of those things, there's no learning, really. So I think the zone of proximal development is really thinking about, you know, what it sort of helps you to think about what you're going to do next in your session. And Vygotsky would say the relationship is key. So if you know your student well enough, and if you know, first of all, what they need, but what their level is, and sometimes we can pitch things too high, and then you think, gosh, you make assumptions about what they know, so you might need to take a step down, you know. But I think I would encourage people to look up more about the zone of proximal development, because I think it's kind of pitching what you need to do in the class. And I have some examples there, but Lisa, I might draw on you if you wanted to give some other insights into Vygotsky. I was going to think of other examples in the world, you know, say Vygotsky, I know, say even in the world of parenting or working with people, it's just being aware of what people can do or can't do in any aspect of learning. But yeah, what would you say about Vygotsky?
Yeah, it's reassuring for students to know as well that they're not being faced with an enormous list of all the things they can't do. You're just looking at what's the next thing I can do, I can learn. You know, so it helps to see your learning in where am I now and what's the next thing I have to learn, because otherwise it becomes too much to think of, you know, those lists of all the tasks you can't achieve yet, you know. Yes. So it helps to focus on where your learning is.
Very good, and thanks, Lisa, because I often think of the zone of proximal development as is a way of identifying the steps involved in what people need to learn. Because often as tutors you might think, oh, I've done newspaper articles or I've done forms, but the complexity of tasks, I think it's a good way of explaining that. And I'll just give you an example. The basic student, he came in, he had lots of doctor's appointments and hospital appointments, but his issue was that he needed to, so if you got a letter in, it might say, okay, you have to go to X hospital on, you know, the 15th of March or whatever. But I realized his issue was that he couldn't read the calendar. So I made the assumption that he knew things like the sequence of the months of the year, the days of the week. You know, so I had to take a step back and just take one calendar page and make sure, you know, the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or even that he knew how to find the date. So, you know, I just think it helps to sort of pitch what you're doing, you know, and so on. And even with higher level students, I do think it comes down to the relationship. If you know what your student needs, and I know people might say, oh gosh, that's fine in a one-to-one, but even in a group, if you know, I suppose, where the gaps are and what people can do, and also, you know, it can be demotivating to do things that people can do anyway. So, yeah. So anyway, I hope people find that visual useful. I have some other examples and literature if people are interested, and you can just let me know.
Do you think we should go to Fergus and see whether people have questions at this stage, because it's 10 to 12?
Yeah, I think so. I don't have that many more slides. I was just going to go through briefly some resources. But if anyone had questions, or what do you think, Fergus? Will I go ahead and finish the slides? I wanted to go through.
I'd love to see the resources you have, and then we'll try and get to some. We've definitely a few questions here and a few ideas, but I think you should finish and show your resources, Fiona. They'd like that.
Great, fantastic. All right, so just to say now again, when people go to these things, you often have lots of resources, you know, that maybe people look at or don't look at, but I just wanted to give you resources that I found useful. And the first one there is simplifying or adapting texts. We would do this a lot in DALC, and it can be sometimes frustrating that there isn't sort of ready-made. There is some ready-made resources that just for people to get more confident with reading, but I would do a lot of simplifying and adapting text. So I'm going to show you, now again, this is just an example. I was trying to think of a positive news story during the lockdown, and one of them was, you know, the paddle boarding story. So this is just an example. Say if you were working on this text, right? That's from the journal.ie. It's quite busy. There's lots of words and so on. So I just want to show you how I simplified it. So I kept in things like the date, the headline, put in some pictures. Now even that is quite long, but depending on your level, the level of the student, I took out some of the detail. I left in some of the detail. So I think it's, but also just to say with that, I've used Comic Sans, which I think is good for, you know, use development materials, or Century Gothic. The size of the font there I've used is 16. I think that it's good to use 16 or 14 with the font size or space and so on. Okay, so yeah, audiobooks. I think people think reading that you need to be able to read, but being read to and listening to books and listening to stories, I think really helps. Even with basic students, you know, Kobo is an anagram book actually, but that's a free resource as well. Audible you need to pay for. I know during lockdown I think some of it was free, but I think, you know, if your student at all wanted to engage with the audiobooks, there's some other general reading text. So this is, say, if you want to pull a worksheet or a reading piece from Boggles World or fest.ie. That's the ETB site. There's some good ones there. World Book Online. Now, I've only become familiar with this in the last couple of months, but it's like an encyclopedia online. So you would search for anything, and it gives you generates a piece of text. But again, it may need some adapting and simplifying. And examinations.ie, I think, is great. It's all the past papers from the Junior Cert and Leaving Cert. And I think that's a really useful resource as well. Dictionary.com, I've mentioned already. The Gatehouse books. Now, I don't know what centres people are working in and if they have a resource room or a forum to share resources, but Gatehouse books are great, particularly with ESOL. They're kind of adult stories done in a sort of a simple way. And the Citizens Information website is good as well for general information, particularly if people are you know, have issues with sort of administrative stuff. And then, you know, news sites like Breaking News, RT, Journal.ie and so on. So that's just ones I've used actually that I think are useful. Now, pre-text, I might get Lisa to talk about that maybe later on, but just, okay, to finish up then, I'm going to finish with a couple of quotes just to get you thinking about reading. So this one is from John Dewey. Anyone who's done a course in teaching and education may have come across him before, but I liked this quote because it says, education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. I sometimes think we think of reading as, oh, I'll only engage in reading when I become more confident with reading or a better reader, but reading is everywhere. You know, people can't sort of avoid it, and because of the social practices and tasks people need to do in life, you know, people need to be able to read. But also reading is a cognitive skill, so the more people read, they get better at it and become more familiar with it. And it's fantastic when you can see that development in students where they start to sort of notice text and things like that. All right, it was World Literacy Day a couple of days ago, and I picked this lovely quote from our own Michael D. And really the quote is about empowerment, all right, because, you know, with reading, we hope people become more engaged in the world, and really that people start to read the world as well as the world, you know, that they become more critically aware of things, more, engage and talk about things. So we often think we don't teach conversation, but we find because of the text we're reading, people can get more engaged and more aware of things. And finally, I want to finish with a quote from a student in Dalk. Now, I sat down with a student a couple of months ago. We were trying to capture the student voice through our blog. And sometimes because of the training and webinars and everything, we forget that we're, you know, there's people we're working with. But I liked this quote here. I can see things on posters that I've never seen in my whole life. Like before, it was just a blank wall. I can see things now I have never seen before. So it's that idea of, I know that particular student said she would go into a shop and wouldn't notice, but now she's looking at labels and she's starting to see the P for potatoes or whatever. You know, so it's kind of, you know, reading is fantastic that people do become more aware and engaged and so on. All right, so Fionnaigh, that's me, Fergus. So I think if we start with the Q&A, if you'd like to.
Yep. Thanks a million, Fiona. That was fantastic. Just so many ideas and tips. I can see the comments coming in. People loved it. You know, it was great. The Lisa's snakes and ladders Dulce list. The Google, what do you call it? The microphone app went down well. The icebreakers. Quite a lot of people say, could you send those on to us, Fiona, when I send on your presentation? They like
the
those.
Yeah.
The book creator too.
Yeah, I could call up the icebreakers now if people wanted to have a
Please.
quick look. Yeah, as people are talking there, I can get that. So, okay, so we have created a blog. We've called it Adlitting. We were trying to think about a trendy title. This blog post here, I can copy the link there, but you can find it online. If people just went to adlitting.ie, and I have compiled a list along with a colleague of all the icebreakers I've used. Some of them are name, gesture, name games. You know, my name is Tom and I like to play football. Adjective, name games. I mean, usually with any training I've been involved in, there's always some element of icebreakers. The toilet roll paper game is an interesting one. I liked this. You know, you give people a roll of toilet paper and they take, you don't say, you just get them to take, say, 3 sheets or 4, and then they just say 2, 3 things about themselves or 4 things about themselves and so on. And then lots of creative things, Chinese whispers, categories, yeah. Light-hearted debate, coffee, yeah. So, okay. Perfect.
Great, thanks a million. We're short on time, so we might have about 5 minutes. I'll read out a few comments and questions, and Fiona or Lisa, you can step in and comment. So, first of all, Mary Bambrick has kindly reminded me that there's a new Open Door book coming out. The Open Door series was famous Irish authors mainly writing kind of short stories in plain English for people who maybe hadn't read novels before. So Patricia Scanlon, who started the idea with New Island Books, is taking some of the more popular ones, editing them and redoing them again in plain English. So that's called Voices, and it'll be coming out at the end of this month. So just keep an eye on the NALA website for that. So some of your learners might like that. Vanessa Kirby said, when you mentioned audiobooks, Fiona, she commented that audiobooks are free from your local library BorrowBox app. Okay. And she said, Vanessa said, it's also free to join the library. So thanks, Vanessa. Okay. So Mary Curtis has a question, Fiona or Lisa. In a group, how do you discourage other students helping, i.e. reading out the word another student is struggling with?
Yeah. Yeah, Lisa, do you want to come in there? I might come in. Yeah, I might come in there. Yeah, I think it's a great question because this does come up actually for us. But what I would do is we would work on sort of ground rules. Now we call them ground rules, but they're sort of, I would say, you know, for us to work in a good way. Let's think of ground rules. And often people would say, well, I'm only helping, but I would say to people just to give people a few minutes, so kind of set it down as a ground rule that I know you're trying to help, but maybe if we just say, while people are reading, let Mary or Tom or Fergus give them a few minutes to work it out, because it can be frustrating, but I would just bring it back to the sort of ground rules and reflect on it. So Lisa, I don't know if you had something to say there.
No, the same thing. I mean, eventually a group I had, it was an ongoing problem, and eventually we discussed it, like why people liked being left for a minute. And it was coming from a good place. People didn't want their neighbour being uncomfortable, struggling with a word, But anyway, they began to self-police it, and eventually when someone interrupted, the whole group would shout, "Stop!" So it becomes you discuss it, I suppose, like everything in adult ed, you discuss it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah. Super.
Okay, thanks, Mary, for that question. John Ryan has got a comment or a tip. He liked what you're saying about Vygotsky, and he said Vygotsky could be applied to digital literacy skills, particularly for learners at levels 2 and 3, leading to more independent learning at level 4, as learners would have the confidence to at least try what they can't do. Very empowering.
Yes, I think that's great, absolutely, because I think we make assumptions, with people's literacy level that they may be basic with digital, and I found actually the opposite. I was getting cool emojis and links from people that I would have thought would be my basic group. Absolutely, but yeah. And Lisa,
Right.
You were going to come in there, were you?
No, same thing. We're going to do that on Monday, where it's a very, very basic group. Sinead is at home in Kildare, and we are going to, in the group, try to contact her by WhatsApp from the group, so people can practice contacting her by WhatsApp and reading the book creator in the group. So there's your scaffolding. We're not saying to them go home and work online with Sinead. We're going to do it in the group, scaffold it. Tuesday they're going to try it in a different room in the centre with her. Eventually, hopefully, they can contact her in case they're locked down or they themselves have to isolate. They'll be able to contact her on WhatsApp. So yes, exactly. It's the zone. What's the next simple thing? We're not trying Google Docs with that group because they don't have PCs or internet skills. We're staying with WhatsApp. So yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I do think, and I know Fergus, this might be something Nala may address again about specifically teaching remote learning. I think it'll become a reality. If we think of the requirements for literacy, technology is part of it, even being able to use WhatsApp and so on. And you can see how isolated people were and how it just, there was a real gap during lockdown, that needed to be addressed.
We had a good few webinars in April, May on teaching remotely, and they went really well, but we're going to have more for sure.
Yeah, super.
And Mary Curtis has a few questions and comments. So she liked the Google Doc thing, and she's talking about, Fiona, how is it for punctuation in Google Docs?
Yeah, I think with Google Docs, from my experience of using it, you need to edit it and punctuate it yourself. So if you did it with the student or even before a class, you need to go in and check it. Because as I said, things like proper nouns or place names, a bit like the dictionary online, it doesn't recognize it. So you would need to go back and punctuate it. But it works just like Microsoft Word. You just go in and you put in your full stops or your quotation marks and so on. Was that the question? Yeah,
it was a question. It seemed to work well with the example you read out, Fiona. You stopped at the end of each sentence and it seemed to work okay.
It did, but it didn't put in a full stop. If you noticed, Fergus, so you would need to go in and put in a full stop. And also, even with a basic student, sometimes I would put things on separate lines rather than a paragraph. So again, it depends on the level and it depends on what group you're working with. But you couldn't just do a raw Google Docs microphone without having to edit it and check it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Susie. And then a follow-on from that, there's a tip from Mary Curtis, which sounds great. She said, I've got my learners to record on their phones and get the partner to read what was typed. Some results can be funny.
Ooh, very good.
Yeah.
Super, that's great.
Very good, I like it.
Yeah. So a few people said, can they get the slides from today's webinar? And the answer is yes. So Fiona will send them to me and I'll send them out to everyone who's registered. Also, we're recording this, so if you want to look back over anything, it'll be on the NALA YouTube channel. That's NALA Ireland YouTube next week. I think we should just maybe take one more question because we're over time. Fiona, there's a question from you from Anne-Marie Foley. Could Fiona please explain a little more about what she means by what overall reading skills are we trying to teach them?
Okay, yeah, basically I was thinking that when a student comes to you or when you're with a group, it's often you're working on reading for the purpose of, say, if they're doing a QQI or if they come for a particular reason or motivation. But I think you need to be aware of you're teaching them reading skills for life, if you know what I mean, rather than just being able to read that particular text. So say if someone said, you know, I'm getting loads of, say, doctor's appointment letters and I can't read them. That's for one specific purpose. But if you think of all the other skills, does that make sense? So because often people would say to me, oh, I work, you know, on reading with the student, but I don't mention phonics or the sounds. And you kind of think, oh, that's, you know, English is an alphabetic language. You need to mention sounds, you know, you need to help them to break up words or have a strategy for unfamiliar words, you know, and things like that. So you're trying to teach them other skills. It's a bit like, you know, Lisa and myself were talking about this. Sometimes in literacy, that idea of learner-centeredness can be hijacked to mean that you only do what the student wants. But really, in your practice, you need to be aware that you're there to serve people and to sort of give them even long-term skills that they can use. Does that make sense? Am I answering that?
Yeah. Just on the Google Docs microphone app, and Mary Curtis and Claire Sanders have said something like, if you say full stop, it works sometimes. And Claire Sanders said, I think you can tell the computer verbally to put in a full stop and enter a new line, etc. So thanks.
That's great. Yeah. Rather than it spelling FULLSTOP.
Yeah, it sounds like it, yeah, from what you said.
Super.
So, Fiona, it just leaves me to say, there's a lot more comments I haven't read out, which are all saying, brilliant webinar, Fiona, thanks so much, great ideas, loved it, that kind of thing. A lot of people have typed in that, including Mary Bamberg, Anne-Marie Foley, Zaid, Dinelly. Lots of people have typed in, loved it. So great. Thanks a million, Fiona and Lisa, for your ideas and tips and resources and just motivating people. And thanks everyone for joining in at home or in the office or in wherever you are. As I said, this will be recorded.
Just to say, I've left my contact details. I'm more than happy for anyone to email me about anything else. I've left it up there. So
right. Thanks again, and we've gone a bit over, so goodbye everyone. I'll end the email to all, or end the webinar to all, sorry.
Thanks,
okay. Thanks everyone, bye-bye.
Bye.